Francesca, and good afternoon everybody, and welcome to Building Stronger Things, the follow-on event from the Stronger Things conference, which my organisation PPL co-sponsored earlier on this year, and which I think we all found a really exciting and energising opportunity to come together and to think about, how we could do things differently in the future, how we could think differently, and how as communities we could really come together to build a better world. I'm your chair, Claire Kennedy. I am both the co-founder and managing partner at PPL. I'm also vice chair of New Local, so I'm here in a dual role today. I'm going to do a bit of introduction and a bit of framing, and also I've got a list of admin which I'm going to make sure I cover off properly to make sure that we're all set up administratively. And then I'm going to hand over to our panel, who I'll introduce shortly, to frame our conversation today, and there'll be an opportunity for you to come together in smaller groups to reflect, to share some of the energy and the ideas that both came from Stronger Things, but also that will come from the conversation today. At the conference itself, one of the things that really struck me in the conversations I was part of was people talking about how exciting they find the idea of community power and how empowering it is, but also the challenge of doing it in practice. So what does it really mean? How will we do it? What are the steps we have to take? And lots of people said to me in the conversations I had, this is great. When we go back to our home environments, how are we going to do this differently? And that was what we thought was a really great opportunity for this follow-on event, to really focus on that key question. So what is the community paradigm in practice? How do you translate the ideas of the paradigm into daily practice in a location? And then really excitingly, what does it feel like when it's working? So to get a sense of what it feels like in reality. So those are the three big areas that we're going to be focusing on in the panel discussion, and that will be an opportunity for you to join in and to reflect on in the breakout sessions, and when we come back together to talk about at the end of the session. I'm going to very quickly just run through some of the admin points, which is to say, first of all, if people were happy to put their cameras on, that would be brilliant. It creates a really great environment. It's a lot more connecting for the speakers. Obviously, there's no pressure if people don't want to, but if they do, then please feel free, particularly in the breakout sessions, because it will be great in the breakout sessions for people to be able to have a proper conversation, which is always a lot easier to do when you can actually see people's faces. And also, if possible, if you get the opportunity, just to make sure that your Zoom name is your name, so that if you're called on by anybody, they know who they're talking to and you've been called on, if that makes sense. Francesca from New Local, I don't know, Francesca, whether you can maybe spotlight yourself or make sure that people can see you, is on hand to offer us technical support throughout the event. So if you do have any issues with sound, or you're getting cut off, or anything that is not working, then do just put that in the chat, and Francesca will step in and assist and help you. And that brings me to the chat. So please do use the chat as much as possible to ask questions, to share your reflections, to share any ideas. From the chair, I'll be picking up questions from the chat. So if you do want to ask a question, that's the place to put it. But it's also, again, I found quite often with the virtual events, it can also be a creative space all on its own of people having sort of relevant side conversations. So please do feel free to use it in that way if you'd like as well. I think that is everything. The only other thing to say in terms of the breakout rooms is you will be put into breakout rooms at the appropriate moment. So please don't worry, there's nothing you need to do. You can just sit back and relax and enjoy the conversation and join in as you wish, and you'll be sorted into breakout rooms at the right time. So the way this will work is we'll have a panel discussion for about the next half an hour, where I'll introduce our panelists and just share some questions to kick them off, but then I'm really looking forward to hearing their thoughts and insights around this area. We'll then have an opportunity for a question and answer session as all of us together in a plenary. And you'll then be able to join a breakout room for about half an hour to be able to explore some of the questions in more depth and to connect and share ideas. And we'll then all come back together to both formulate our thinking and to kind of share some of the insights that's come from the session, but also hopefully in the spirit of the event to think of some practical next steps that we can do. And one of the things I think would be really great would be if from the next hour and a half, we're all able to identify, even if it's only one really quite small practical next step that we can all do to build community power. So I'm hoping there are no questions that I need to pick up on from the chat so far. I'm hoping that there's nothing that I've said so far that's been controversial in any way. So what I'm going to do is just move us straight into the introductions of our panel. So we've got 3 people on the panel. We're really lucky to be joined by Studdert, the Deputy Chief Exec of New Local. She oversees the research team. She's also one of the co-authors of the Community Paradigm, and I remember fondly the day I first heard about the Community Paradigm back in 2019. She's also this year been one of the co-authors of the follow-up work, which is Community Power, the Evidence, which was published this year. I'm going to hand over to Jess just to introduce the Community Paradigm and to give us a bit of background into where the ideas came from and what as a group you at New Local hope to achieve from it.
Thanks very much, Claire, and just to say thanks so much for being able to do this event. It's great to have a follow-up to our Stronger Things event, and really pleased on behalf of New Local to be working with PPL on it. So yeah, the Community Paradigm is kind of 2 years old, as we first published it a couple of years ago. I hope we think of it as our articulation of existing practice and the range of kind of community power practice that already exists across the country in different ways. And I think our purpose with setting it out as more of a kind of a deeper paradigm shift was to try and patch together various bits of practice that might see themselves as different, but actually as a whole kind of together indicate a way forward for public services. I guess to start out with what the community paradigm isn't, it could potentially be helpful. We very much framed the two existing public service paradigms that dominate our public service framework currently as the state paradigm and the market paradigm. And I think it's just helpful to kind of reflect on what they are, because the community paradigm is a kind of a way of overcoming some of the shortcomings of those. So the state paradigm is the kind of dominant paradigm for our public service architecture as we know it today, which very much came about in the middle of last century. But it's that kind of historic hierarchical model, very much based on kind of professionalised service silos, standardised provision, and sees the individual as a passive recipient of services. The market paradigm, we'll kind of know in various guises, came to force in the last 40 years or so. It's probably now the dominant paradigm, and it's much more focused on cost savings and efficiencies. It views the individual as a customer who takes part in a transaction, but there's no kind of deeper leveraging of the individual's insights. Both paradigms have dwindling returns, not just in an era of austerity where there's obvious kind of limits and diminishing returns to efficiencies, but they're not fundamentally capable of addressing some of the complex intergenerational challenges that public services are confronted with today. Then the challenges that we face might be so-called kind of cross-cutting challenges that don't neatly fit into service silos and professionalisms and can't always be narrowly costed as a unit transaction. So as I say, that we didn't kind of make it up, it exists itself. The community paradigm is what we kind of like to think of as current practice that exists outside the logic of the existing system, but it very much shows us the way that if we could kind of mainstream that into a kind of deeper system shift, it kind of shows us the way towards more sustainable services, much more focused on prevention, much more focused on understanding and working with people's innate capabilities. So at the core is the notion of community power, which is just the principle that communities themselves, people themselves, have a wealth of knowledge and assets, which if they're understood and nurtured by practitioners and policymakers, they have the potential to strengthen resilience and enable sustainable prevention-focused public services. By community, there's a flexible notion of community. We talk about communities as defined geographically, by place, by neighbourhood, you're part of a community because you're a resident in a particular area, or by common interests, such as the common issue, common experience or condition a group of people in a place share. And that notion of community can have different relevances for different circumstances. But the report you mentioned, Claire, that we recently published identifies 3 ways that community power is being enabled in practice. So I'll just briefly kind of touch on those 3. First is around decision making, giving communities direct decision making. We're seeing a lot more use of deliberative and participatory tools within councils, holding citizens' assemblies, for example, on climate change, trying to tackle some of these big thorny issues by working with people to kind of understand what's possible and give them ownership of their role in doing that. And we're seeing lots of ways in which kind of participatory budget making and decision making is being given to communities to have direct say over a specific resource. Second area is collaborating directly with communities, working with them as equal partners to understand their insights and use that to design services. So we're seeing practices such as strength-based practice, asset-based approaches, co-production being used much more fundamentally. And the third area is building community capacity and assets. So that might be kind of hard assets like asset transfer, communities running community facilities and buildings being passed over to community ownership, or cooperative models where people have a bigger stake in a service or an activity, or kind of softer asset-based community development, which is based on people working with communities to kind of understand their challenges, understand what the solutions would be in a more sustained way. And we're seeing that particularly in kind of maybe deprived areas on estates that have particular challenges. To work through what sustainable outcomes would be in that situation. The challenge with it is there's no set rule book. Everywhere's different. So it's much more of a kind of an approach and a method and a mindset and a culture, which makes it at the same time very exciting, as it's also very challenging because you can't kind of do it off the shelf. And there's a whole kind of set of issues about how permissive the kind of national framework is for a lot of this or not. But I'll leave my comments there because I know that we've got lots of other interesting speakers to hear from and pick up some of this hopefully in the questions. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks very much, Jess. It's fascinating. And like I am also quite excited to pick up on some of that in the questions. I think there's a really great sort of seamless link from what you were just talking about, particularly in terms of how professionals and policymakers can really nurture what's found in communities, as we hand over to our second panelist, who is Simon Morioka, who's my fellow co-founder and managing partner at PPL. PPL is a social enterprise dedicated to improving outcomes in health and care. Simon's also a former local authority and NHS director. And Simon's going to just talk briefly about the challenge really of translating policy into practice. So how do we take all the great thinking and the ideas that Jess has just set out? What are the steps that we need to think about when we're translating that into practice and reality? And over to you, Simon. Thank you.
And I was reminded in thinking about the event in advance today that it's probably coming up to about 20 years that I've been working on integration in health and social care. And most people's experience of health and social care is still disintegrated. So I may not be the best person to be speaking about this today. But I was really reminded in the context of what Jess was saying of one particular example, which was around the People Powered Health Programme, which is from 2011-12. So almost has the benefit of us having a bit of hindsight as well, and involves some absolutely incredible people, of whom I think Nick Dixon spoke at the conference. I think he's on the event at the event today. And the People Powered Health Programme was very much driven by the idea that co-producing not just services but outcomes between individuals and professionals and communities was one of the few ways in which we were going to be able to tackle some of the really massive challenges facing our public services and facing particularly the health and care services. And obviously co-production wasn't new in 2010-11. It had roots back in the 70s and beyond, and people like the New Economics Foundation, the IPPR, King's Fund had spoken about it in a UK context just previous to that. But it certainly felt quite ambitious at the time. And there were three things that I really remember through that programme, which I thought would be worth just sharing and reflecting on today. So the first was around evidence, and specifically the perceived lack of evidence for doing something new and innovative. And this came up so often. I remember somebody in frustration saying at one point that did people realize that they'd never done a randomized controlled trial for parachutes, but we would all be quite happy to have a parachute if we needed one. And one of the things I think that we learned quite quickly was that the evidence was really what we were building through trying to do things differently. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much if we couldn't produce every single spreadsheet, every single report, and every single evaluation that people might want to see before they changed. but also that we were really challenging a lot of practice for which there was very little evidence. So I would be really interested to see if there's any evidence that disintegrated care works really well, or solutions that are not co-produced between service users and the people supporting them works. And one of the benefits, I think, of the People Powered Health Programme was that, with Nesta and Innovation Unit and others kind of helping to really drive it, there was a hub, but there was also a real drive coming from the 6 sites that were involved. And actually the sharing and the learning and the support that those 6 sites provided each other, I think was absolutely critical to sustaining what was often quite a difficult journey in terms of trying to get new ways of working adopted across different sectors and across different parts of the country. And the second thing I thought would be worth mentioning in that context was around narrative. And I suspect I'm kind of preaching to the converted in terms of the power of narrative. And that few of us would disagree with the idea that, empowering people and communities is a good thing to do, although we might end up in a big debate about whether empowerment is the right word. But the reality is, for most people who are not directly involved in those kinds of debates, if they haven't had any experience of needing public services, they tend to expect public services to work in a way that we think is an innovation. So people tend to expect that professionals will talk to each other. They tend to expect that their needs and their particular circumstances and assets will be taken into account. They tend to expect that communities will be engaged. And it's quite a rude awakening, I think, when people find themselves in a situation where actually all those expectations which we quite reasonably bring to the relationship aren't fulfilled. And often people are very happy when they have had a lot of experience with public services for any help that they've been able to secure through often quite bureaucratic and tortuous processes. I'm very anxious about giving any of that up. So I think finding something that cuts through that with both professionals and with people at large, I think is really important. And the example that came to mind was around group consultations, which are comparatively quite common these days. There was a lot of professional concern about whether you could do consultations with groups of people who were suffering from long-term health conditions at the time, issues of privacy, practicality, concerns that it was a coda for just trying to get people to do more work for the same amount of remuneration. And I remember a consultant coming out of one of the consultations where she'd been in a room for an hour with 12 other people and saying, it's only now that I realize that I was the only person in those conversations who wasn't suffering from chronic pain. And actually listening to the people in that room describe to each other how they are coping with their conditions was the most profoundly moving experience that she'd had as a professional in all those years of trying to work with those individuals as individuals. And the third area, which I just wanted to highlight, was around timelines. And about the same time as we were doing People Powered Health, we were doing some work around integrating care with people like Peter Colclough in Torbay. And one of the questions that people used to ask Peter was, how long did it take to set up an integrated health and care system that was person and community centered in Torbay? And he would say, it takes 10 years. And people would say, well, it's very unlikely in our location, in our geography, in our situation, we're going to get people to be able to start today on an idea that's going to take 10 years to manifest itself. And he would say, well, then it's going to take you 10 years and a day. So I don't think we should be put off by the scale of the change that's implied by some of the things that we're talking about today, but you have to start somewhere. And just briefly, in terms of where that led us through the People Powered Health journey, well, I think anything ever happens in isolation, and anything that we see that's been successful is the product of lots and lots of different people's commitment, support, energy, enthusiasm, persistence. And actually one of the success of programs like that is we no longer talk about them as programs of innovation, we just talk about them as the way we deliver services. But the fact, I think, that you've got social prescribers now being recruited into every primary care network in the country at a very local level, and the fact that you've got in every single national strategy that's been produced in the last 5 years, a real commitment to personalisation, to person-centred care, and to a lot of the things that came out of the co-production agenda, is a tribute to the fact that if you can persevere and operate in terms of influencing nationally, but also delivering locally, then change is possible, and real change that is meaningful is possible. And I was very lucky to be able to go back and interview Dennis O'Rourke, who was the lead for the Lambeth Living Well Collaborative, which was one of the 6 sites, and meet with one of the Lambeth mothers whose son had been sectioned, had been in the Maudsley, and had been supported through the Living Well Collaborative. And at the end of the interview, she said, I'm embarrassed to admit that my biggest concern now is about my son's choice of girlfriend. And I think if we can, through whatever we can do to change the paradigm, achieve just that one change for one person, then I think all of this becomes worthwhile. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to bring you now Joanna Resnick to talk about the experience of community power and community interaction working together. Before I introduce Joanna properly, Joanna's the exec producer of Slung, which is a theatre company based in Holbeck in Leeds. But you can see that her background is not the traditional pink new local and PPL background. I'm going to let Joanna explain the context of her background, but just so you're reassured, it is a deliberate act. So Slung are a people's theatre specialists. They make non-traditional theatre spaces where there's meaningful participation and professional skills come together. They also, and this is particularly relevant to where Joanna is at the moment, they also manage the oldest working men's club in Britain, which Joanna's going to talk about. And all the activities that happen within the Holbeck are operated on a pay-as-you-decide basis. So it's a really exciting and democratic space. And I'm going to hand over to you, Joanna, now to give some context and to talk about what it feels like to see community power and to feel community power in action.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yes, so I am currently speaking from the snooker room of the Holbeck, which is currently doubling as our food bank, which is why I've got such an interesting background behind me and a mountain of toilet rolls. We as part of our activity here, we set up started to respond to social care referrals in our community at the beginning of the pandemic. We were doing that for a couple of weeks, and then the council invited us to take over as a ward lead, and we've been doing that ever since, alongside all of the kind of cultural activity that we do here. And we are we're quite a small team at Slung, but we do a number of things. So we produce large-scale theatre. We run this venue as a social club, as an arts centre. We now run a food bank, a non-media self-referring. A few years ago, we launched what we call the Cultural Community College, which was an experiment for us and sort of an interesting sort of provocation in our area, looking at adult cultural education, because a lot of we'd been creating a large-scale show and had to do with that a lot of training, operating boats, working at high level, on ropes and at height and all that sort of thing, and in our conversations around that and education, we were realizing that there was a lot of people who, if you weren't part of higher education or if you weren't doing sort of in-work training, there were fewer and fewer opportunities to learn outside of those traditional systems. And increasingly they were financially unavailable to members of our community. So we launched the Cultural Community College, which takes culture really broadly, and we've hosted courses in CPR to South Indian cooking to trying to think, welding, batbox making, Irish dancing, and our first course was stargazing, because it was quite a sort of a poetic choice, because it's a really profound thing to be able to read the stars, but actually you can't really monetize it. So how would a community respond if we could offer them the chance to learn for the sake of learning? And increasingly over time, so we launched that in 2018, increasingly that program has been curated by the members. When we started in 2018, we went to our local Holbeck Gala and asked members of our community what it is that they wanted to learn. And actually people came back to us overwhelmingly saying language courses, Italian, Spanish, French. And that's because when they think education outside of sort of evening courses, the first thing that they thought of was languages. And so we realized quite early on we had to program a few things to start with to get them thinking, no, really open up your imagination. Do you want to learn crochet? Do you want to learn to eat fire? All of that sort of thing. And then so we programmed the first 2 terms, and then as I say, increasingly we would always talk to people after the courses and invite them to suggest things, and we've been really excited in the last couple of years, then actually a number of those participants have come back to teach courses themselves. So one example is someone who came and took part in a writing workshop, but is actually a retired design and technology teacher and recently taught how to make back boxes. And often, you know, there are people who suggest things and we don't know anyone who teaches those courses, so we go out and we find the best teachers available. So that's, I suppose that's one example of how we've kind of opened up that process and ensured that that program and that offer is really driven by the members of that community. And then I suppose another example is the Holbeck Club, which is where we're based, and we moved here in 2019, and it's a club that's owned by the members, but we manage the space day to day. So the balance that we have here is ensuring that we sort of preserve and look after the traditional activities that those who have been coming for years enjoy and can be proud of, but opening it up to those that might not have been not felt welcome here, or might not come from a culture of drinking, or just might not have had need to come to this space before. And it's important for us here that we're trying to find a snappier way of saying it, but everyone gets what they want, but nobody gets to stop other people from getting what they want. And so so we're constantly, there's constant tensions with that. So there was when we launched the food bank, and then we started to reopen the bar when COVID rules permitted last year, there was a real tension between those who wanted to use this place for snooker and the need for the food bank to continue, which was actually serving other members of the club. And so there's a constant back and forth. So that we're constantly trying to drive up everyone getting what they want, but not preventing other people from having those same opportunities. And just speaking about a point that Simon made about sort of cutting through those bureaucratic processes is really important. We try as much as possible to be as responsive as we can to those who maybe want to use the space for their own functions and events. And Leeds City Council's Parks team recently have been a great example of someone else when we've been similarly approaching them about wanting to use Holbeck Moor for a number of functions. Trying to kind of cut through that and sort of saying a quick yes buys you so much time and momentum, because momentum is everything for us at the moment. And a quick yes, well, don't worry, paperwork can follow later, but the dates are in and you're in, and keep running with it. It's just that's, I suppose that's one useful thing that we find. A really quick yes or even a quick no is really helpful, because then you can go and sort of find someone else. So I realise I've jumped around a little bit there, because there's lots that we do that touch on different types of sort of co-creation, co-curated work. But hopefully that kind of gives you a bit of a taster, because yeah, I think the roles that the projects that we've done where there's sort of meaningful participation and sort of co-creation in our work have been the most culturally diverse and exciting, and have meant a lot. So,
thank you very much. Thanks very much, Joanna. It was fascinating and really inspiring and really interesting. And probably the only time I've heard someone talk about fire eating as an option for something you could do in an evening class, which I now am quite enthusiastic to try. I'm gonna, if it's okay, Joanna, I was going to stay with you for the first question, really, because there have been a few questions that have popped up in the chat, and one of them, which I think links directly to what you were just talking about, is around a question from Claire, moving past the need to record outcomes to prove things work. It sounds like that's something that you've had to do some work around, that it can be challenging to demonstrate, say, efficiency savings, for example, in a community work context. And I just wondered whether that was something you had experience of in your relationship with the council, for example, or with other local partners.
Yes. So I'm trying to think of what examples to respond with, because I suppose every different part of what we do we're constantly reporting back to different funders. We're very fortunate that particularly in response to COVID, people have been our funders have been really responsive to what we do here. and in fact, quite a lot of the time we're able to kind of set the terms of how we're working and our own KPIs. So only time that comes under tension was when the rules changed. So it was interesting when we started doing the food bank. We were, as I say, we were asked by the council to take on the kind of the ward level responsibilities, and they said, here's £5,000, here's basically enough to get you going, and we'll come back to you and hopefully we'll just keep talking, and we invested on as much as basically the council were, so it was much more a partnership and rather than a kind of a service so it wasn't a service level agreement, and it was interesting over time that as the system started to click in and people started to come back into work, and the kind of the lay of the land started to settle, a lot of those traditional processes, monitoring and all of that stuff started to click in. And so when there was an instance where the rules changed, which meant that people would get 3 parcels and then that would be it, and then they'd have to go through the motion again, and there was a lot of tension there for us, because we had been operating and were working on the assumption that we were non-means tested and sort of self-referring, and so we had to have conversations with them, as sort of meeting them as partners and going, it's not a service that we're working to, it's something that we do together. So a lot of the time we work through those in discussion, if that makes sense. So yeah, sometimes that does sort of butt up against what you're doing, but then we find other ways through. So with the college, for example, we are working with an academic, a researcher, and in fact, because there are a few there's obviously the kind of statistical things that you can take, number of participants and how many people attended each session and what was their retention like. A much more meaningful and interesting approach is one that she's taking, which very much responds to the individuals and gathers those stories. So there's a balance, I suppose, between those different ways of capturing and recording what you're doing. And I think a lot of the time you don't quite know the impact that you're having, and the impact that you're having might not happen for another sort of 25 years. You might be rehearsing an opera in the car park, for example, and it might not be till that young child who's seen it as they're kind of on their bike is in their 50s still playing that music and thinking back to a nicer time. You might not be there for that, but you are part of that. So it's sometimes hard to quantify.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's those narratives and those stories that stretch through whole generations, as you say, and trying to articulate them is a massive challenge. And I'm conscious we've got quite a few really interesting questions coming through in the chat. So I think with the agreement of the facilitators, we're going to just keep going for a little bit more in terms of the chat and have a slightly shorter breakout session, if that's all right. In terms of the next, there's a few questions around sort of partnership and equality in terms of partnership. Jess, I wondered if you would just be able to reflect on that for a bit, the challenges of creating genuinely equal partnerships in a community paradigm context.
Yeah, well, just also reflecting on Joanna's comments, I think probably the last year has been incredibly instructive in terms of the experience of COVID between public services, the voluntary sector and existing kind of community sector and people themselves, where I can see there's a lot of interesting chat going on in the comments here about the kind of culture of councils and the hierarchy and traditional ways of doing things, and kind of in normal times pre-COVID, decisions kind of went up the chain, were approved and came down, and it was slow, necessarily bureaucratic, potentially subject to accountability, governance. And the risk of doing something different was highly fraught because there was a permanency, and that's what the kind of state paradigm approach kind of relies on. It wants predictability, it wants all that. But what happened with the pandemic is suddenly doing nothing became the riskier option, and what ended up happening was that everything else was stripped away. The kind of the eligibility criteria, the thresholds for need were totally removed, and that is what characterises so much of the conversation that councils have with their communities, because there are resource constraints and there are kind of governance and regulation constraints. But what was really interesting about the kind of first few weeks and months of the pandemic was that risk reward profile shifted, and suddenly very human conversations were enabled to be had between council officers and communities, and there was no kind of questioning about where need was. It was articulated, and mountains were moved to get what was needed where it was needed. And as Joanna's saying, and this kind of reflects what we hear from our network, you know, then the kind of normal times-ish kind of come back in, or normal process, the time comes that normal processes can be kind of re-established. And obviously we're not out of the pandemic woods yet, but there has been the kind of creep of the traditional structure. So I think that's the real challenge for a lot of councils, is that, you know, there were some very interesting things happened in a period of intense crisis. Clearly, we do not want a period of intense crisis to be the norm, but there are some learnings from that about how it's possible to have very different relationships with communities. But it does remain the fact that there are kind of accountabilities that stem all the way up to Whitehall about how you as a public service are required to spend public resource, and so there still can be and will be systemically that kind of that risk aversion, but we do see in particular teams within councils in particular areas much more kind of frontline autonomy, where it's being given and where that kind of permissiveness is being given to people who work and on the front line with people. There can be some very different conversations had, and very different, and really kind of feed that up to how the public services operate in different ways. We see that a lot in kind of people-facing services. So I think there's a point Tracy made in the chat about the culture of organisations and the kind of permissiveness for the front line, which I think is a big challenge for public service organisations trying to do this. Are you ready to give that autonomy, and do you have that kind of culture that you understand the difference between kind of accountability and operational freedom, set the mission and the values, but the kind of the delivery is the more flexible entity.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jess. And I just think we've got time for maybe one more very quick question in this section, Simon, which is one for you, which is around the kind of the implications of co-production and people-powered change, as you talked about, in the context of workforce. So for local authorities and in terms of working patterns and working styles. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that before we head into the breakouts, where people have the opportunity to explore these in a bit more detail as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, just to Jessica's point, I think when I started off working as a local government officer, one of the people who was mentoring me said, the thing you have to understand about local government is it's too big for the small things and it's too small for the big things. And I think that is a perpetual tension for local authorities, that you kind of sit in that layer of government where you've still got all of the kind of hierarchy and the bureaucracy sometimes. The other thing that they said was, whilst local government exists, there will never be a tree in this country that's safe. So, you know, we're perpetually kind of engaged in processes of assurance. I saw somebody in the chat had said, you know, it's easier sometimes to get approval for £1 million than £100. And that's the really sad thing, because often what we're talking about here are interventions that cost £100, not £1 million. So I do think that the experience of the pandemic has led to necessarily a lot more decision making at the front line, driven by actual needs and actual experiences within communities, rather than being driven by more abstract policy. And that we have seen some of the benefits of that. There are also risks of that, and we will need to undo, I'm sure, some of the things that have happened in the pandemic. I mean, specifically in terms of workforce, I do think that there's some really interesting models that have emerged over the last few years, Birdsong type models of self-organizing teams, where you are genuinely seeing people coming together in different ways and in less hierarchical ways around the needs of individuals and communities. And I think if we really want fundamental cultural change within the statutory workforce, then it will only come through greater engagement and partnership working, exactly as Joanna has articulated, with the voluntary and community sector. The key thing, I think, always with co-production is it's not an either or thing. So there, particularly if you look at something like mental health services, there are lots and lots of people who have been really scarred by their experiences of the statutory services, really want nothing to do with psychiatrists and psychologists. And then there's lots of people who are brilliant, caring, amazingly intelligent clinicians, but who think that they know what the answer is for their patients. And actually, I think one of the key learnings from the most successful interventions to the original People Powered Health Programme was it wasn't where you had one or the other, but it was where you were able to find ways of overcoming that divide and genuinely create relationships and outcomes based on mutual respect, that you were able to make progress. And if nothing else, I think the pandemic has just re-emphasized that where the power really lies is in communities and in individuals' behavior. You can create all the kind of infrastructure, rules, etc. around that you like, but actually it's what people do that has the final say in terms of the outcomes that are achieved within localities. And if we don't start from that premise, then we're not going to make any progress.
That's great. Thanks very much, Simon. It's actually the perfect point, I think, for us to head into the breakout sessions and to reflect on some of that in terms of both giving people the opportunity to reflect on the conversations and the presentations so far, but also that key question about what can we do and the power of what we can each do as individuals within our local communities as well. I think we're going to have 20 minutes in our breakouts, and it's a sort of free-flowing discussion with some key questions which your facilitator will take you through. So again, please don't worry, just relax and enjoy the conversation and participate. And then you will be automatically brought back into the plenary at the point where the breakouts finish. So again, nothing to worry about. And what we'll hopefully do in the meantime is be able to pick up and maybe group some of the other questions that have come through the chat so that we can pick up some of those in that final plenary as well. I hope that makes sense. Francesca, I'm going to hand over to you to...
Perfect. Everyone should be making their way over now.
Brilliant. So am I the only person left in the main room?
Yeah. Just gonna... Hi, Claire.
Perfect.
Perfect. I think we are all back.
Excellent. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody has made it back from the virtual ether of the breakout rooms. In this final section, what we're going to do is just share, I think, one key sort of point or idea that's come from each of the breakout sessions, and we will be taking the opportunity to write up, obviously sort of anonymized, but write up the ideas and the reflections that have come from the breakout room so we can share them across the whole group. But with there being so many of us, just one key point would be brilliant from each of the facilitators. I'm just going to, Francesca, would you be able to point me to the first facilitator, group one?
That would be David.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, so we had a very in-depth conversation. It's difficult to pick just one point, but we've fundamentally started with a very interesting challenge of should social care even sit with local authorities if it's actually about helping people and supporting people and showing that people are independent. And really we had a very general, broad and interesting conversation therefore about what it means to genuinely give communities independence and the fact that we need to be much more trusting and have faith in our communities and really give them true power so that they can take on some of these support structures that we previously thought of as being parts of the state when actually they should definitely sit more traditionally with our communities.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, David. So it sounds like a great discussion, as you say, quite wide-ranging and wholesome. Natasha, I think, is our next facilitator.
Yes, thank you. So again, a really rich discussion, and I'm looking at a page of scribbles. I think probably the thing that really stood out for me as being, so there were lots of different points of discussion, but one of the things that people came back to over and over again was around burnout and fatigue, and the fact that communities are feeling very tired after what has been an impossible year, and so many other things sort of span out from that. So the need to recognise, the need to acknowledge, the need to support individuals, but also the importance of celebrating and capturing lessons learned, making sure that we don't lose momentum, because the willingness and the motivation is still there. We just need to make sure that with the burnout that doesn't get lost.
I think that's, yeah, sorry, Tasha, carry on.
That's it.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. And again, it's great to see the same challenges reflected from a different perspective in each group. So it's really fascinating. Katie, I'm going to call on you next.
Well, again, we had a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion. The bit I'm going to pick on is building on, I think, a point that David made around trust. So we talked quite a lot about how to build trust. And from a community's point of view, how do community organisations build trust with their neighbourhoods? And how do they build trust with councils and funders? And then from a council point of view, how do they build trust and really give away to control? How do they trust communities to do the things that they need to just get on with and do themselves? And we also talked about that being a set of skills, and skills it's possible to learn, and that thinking about the workforce development implications of that as well on both sides.
Thanks very much, Katie. And again, that point about trust, I know, is one that came up in the chat in the first part of the session as well. So I think it's a really interesting area to reflect on in terms of the points around different partnerships and how to create really positive partnerships moving forward. So I think it's great. Laura, next.
Yeah, interestingly, we also focused on that trust, and we put it in the context of how we enable statutory services, especially local authorities, to understand the difference between who holds the decision making, who holds the accountability, who holds the responsibility, and who holds the delivery. And these things get conflated, and that's where the anxiety comes in managing one of these but letting go of the others. And one thing that came up was the concept of flat pack democracy, which was fascinating. And it's this idea of starting from the smallest organizations, the parish and the town council, and building from there. Again, many other points, but I'm going to keep it brief, so I'm going to pause there.
Thanks very much, Laura. And again, really interesting reflections. And I'd seen the flat pack democracy in the chat again from the first session, so it's great that you got the chance to explore that in a bit more depth as well. And last but not least, Victoria.
Thanks, Claire. Yes, just to say apologies for we were slightly cut off at the end there, but thank you everyone for your contributions in our breakout room. I think to sort of summarise the discussion we had, the key thing that came across for me is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and the barriers that we are experiencing are quite varied, and as a result, our approach needs to be quite flexible and have opportunities for really lifting up the ingenuity, etc., that we've seen through the pandemic. Thinking about it, it's not just a box ticking exercise. We need to be flexible in the channels that we use, how we communicate with our communities, and also who is best positioned to have that conversation. And we also touched on that element of trust, and sort of whether or not communities naturally have trust in the authorities that are approaching them. So it was a really interesting conversation. So thank you everyone.
It's great. Thank you very much, Victoria, and to all the facilitators and to everyone who participated in the breakouts. In this final part, we're going to just bring back the panel, if that's okay, Francesca, if you're able to rejig the pinning, and just ask a couple of the kind of sort of overarching questions that have come through in the chat earlier on that we had a chance to consolidate during the breakouts. While that's going on, I know that in the breakout sessions, people were asked to think about the one next thing that they were going to do, the sort of one practical step. We're really keen that this event catalyses some practical, real change out in the real world. And one of the things that would be really exciting in terms of doing that would be if everyone was happy just to note in the chat the one thing that they would like to do differently. Those of you who attended the Stronger Things conference will have received our postcard about, do what you can with what you have where you are, which is very much a sort of philosophy that is very, perhaps one I personally find very powerful and impactful. And I think it's incredibly relevant to the things we're talking about today around the community paradigm, the ability of one person to be able to do things differently and catalyze a whole chain of innovation. And as Joanna was talking about, real opportunities to change things through whole generations. So if people are comfortable doing so, it would be great to capture some of those one next things in the chat. We won't chase you and come back, but it will be interesting then to be able to reflect on them in the future as well. Thank you in advance for that. And just thank you again to the panel. Welcome back to the hot seat. There's a couple of areas, 2 or 3 areas that we thought would be really interesting just to explore in the final section. One of them is around the term postcode lottery, which came up in the chat earlier on, and it's a theme that often comes up in the context of localism and creating things that are specific for local communities, which may be different from what's found in other local communities. And I think the question was around how can we sort of, what are your thoughts on that, and what are some of the risks that might come from that? Jess, I was going to start with you first, if that's all right. But Joanna and Simon, if you were also happy to, you can have some thinking time on this one, and I'll come to you second and third.
Yeah, no, we actually touched on this in our breakout, so I think it's a really important issue. It's a perennial challenge, actually, that skeptics of any sense of kind of control beyond Westminster and Whitehall tend to kind of trot out as a reason why you wouldn't want to have more local variation, local autonomy and decision making. For me, the concept confuses means and ends. It focuses a postcode lottery of how you deliver things doesn't negate a postcode lottery of outcomes. And we are one of the most centralised countries in the Western world. We're also one of the most starkly unequal countries in the Western world. So centralised standardisation of one size fits all has not stopped there being a postcode lottery of I think the most important postcode lottery for all of us, which is the postcode lottery of life chances. Your life chances are still very much dictated by the place you live and maybe the demographic group that you belong to. And actually we've seen that starkly under COVID, where lots of Black and ethnic minority communities and lots of particular areas of the country have suffered from the same virus in different ways. So if we understand that we are confronted with a highly unequal country, highly unequal outcomes for people, then we must take different starting points in order to meet those needs. And I think what's been interesting under COVID is actually that postcode lottery of outcomes has been really visible and has become much more high profile and much more in the kind of wider public mindset. And so I think there's a real opportunity now for us to have a much more sophisticated conversation about why you do need to have different approaches in different areas that meet different challenges, because you're not confronted with a one size fits all challenge. You need different variable solutions. So it's actually the one thing that I'm going to do after this event, the commitment I'm going to make, is for us to explore the postcode lottery in much more detail, because it's a perennial challenge, and I think it's a real blocker to a lot of this, because it really stops us imagining much more freedom and much more creative approaches to work with communities in ways that are massively needed, and which leverage their own insights and experiences and listen to them and use that to inform how public services work, rather than having a predetermined one-size-fits-all approach.
Thanks very much, Jess. It's really powerful and very, very clear, really helpful. Simon, is there anything you'd like to add to what Jess has said?
I think Jess has said a lot of what I would have said. If I can just offer a personal example. So when my mother was being discharged from her local hospital, where she'd been an inpatient for some time, one of the first questions that the nurse who was coordinating the discharge asked me was which of the 2 boroughs that DGH services she was from. And when I told the nurse, she said, "Thank God." And I think that can't be right. And I think Jess is absolutely right in saying that the postcode lottery is not the risk. The postcode lottery is the reality. That's what we're living with today. And it's a reality that we ignore at our peril. So we might want to pretend that we have a national health service. We might want to pretend that we have universal services. But if you just look at the disparities in public health funding and CAMS funding across the country, we're already in a position where, in terms of at least the inputs, there is huge and I think very difficult to justify variations. Just talked about means and ends, and I completely agree with that. And I think there's also cause and effect. So by trying to have a single model that works everywhere in the same way for everyone, I think we're actually causing a lot of the inequalities that we've seen both pre-COVID and exacerbated through the pandemic. So I strongly believe that there are things we need to do nationally around the allocation of resource to make sure that all communities have access to the same quality of services and all communities have access to the same opportunity of outcomes. In terms of how those resources are used to deliver those outcomes, if they're not tailored to the communities being served, then we aren't going to address some of those key variations.
Thanks very much, Simon. I think that's right. And Joanna, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think the panelists have covered it really well. I mean, from my perspective, because we are in quite in a highly deprived area of the city. So just sort of speaking about that, it's an unequal circumstance already. So we are just responding to that, and so we do that in small practical ways. So when we're releasing college courses, we do it a week to Holbeck residents first before we tell the wider city, because those that are savvier on the computer or quicker or their lives are slightly less chaotic will snap up those opportunities perhaps before other people. And I think also the kind of the differences in those in different communities can also be a real strength. So the fact that a theatre company were asked to lead on the social care referrals for 7,500 households is unusual. That's even unusual in our city where they asked us to do it. But you know, in other parts of the city, there were brilliant cafes that stood up and did that, or organisations who have that infrastructure and actually built much more and are working within kind of social care already. And I think responding to the people there who are engaged, who have the capacity, because maybe they're, I mean, COVID's different because we had a lot of capacity when the theatre shut, but I think being responsive to the people and the opportunities there can be very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. It's great, and again, great to hear that a really practical example of that, of the choices that people and organisations are making that can actually have a really positive impact, that seem like small choices but actually open up a whole load of different opportunities for people as well. That's great. The next area really for us to think about as a panel is in terms of democratic representation, which is always one of the things that I know, again, from my experience working with New Local, is one of the challenges that's often thrown up in the context of the community paradigm, is almost what's the role of local government in this, and how can we reconcile the power of communities with the power that sits within local democracy. And I think it's a really challenging question, but it is one that we have to kind of tackle head on, really, for this to become a reality and for it to be. And to my mind, the question is something to do with partnership as well. It goes back to that question around partnership, but recognising that obviously there's different forms of participation. So Simon, I wonder if I could start with you on this one. Just any reflections on how the community paradigm can sit alongside the existing sort of established democratic processes in a way that enhances them rather than the two existing in competition?
Well, I would see the community paradigm as very much something that has the potential to revitalise local democracy. And again, coming back to that question of cause and effect, I think we have challenges across much of the country that the elected membership isn't necessarily very representative of the communities being served. But then if we look at the way in which austerity has impacted communities, has impacted councils, has impacted people's sense of agency within the place in which they live, it's not surprising that people haven't necessarily seen coming forward and becoming part of the local democratic structures as being a way of actually delivering real and meaningful change for them and their neighbours and the places where they live. So I do think that part of this is about creating a new narrative around local government and around elected members. I know a number of local authorities where they are moving to more neighbourhood-based structures and where elected members are playing a very fundamental part alongside other representatives of the community in shaping what's going on with those neighbourhood budgets and those neighbourhood level services. So I think that, ultimately, elected members are people, and I'm not sure that many people would want to become a councillor if they weren't passionate about changing something positively about the place in which they live. But I do think that this isn't actually a way of making that role a lot more meaningful and a lot more rewarding by recognising that it only is effective if it sits within a much broader network of decentralised and community-based power within which elected members can then be very powerful voices for their communities, but only by listening and engaging with those communities as well.
Thanks very much, Simon. And Joanna, just on the same question, that point about democracy versus alongside communities.
It's an interesting one. I mean, we're very lucky in our ward. Our councillors are brilliant, and it kind of all happens all at the same time, but just in different pockets and in different projects. Yeah, so it's hard to kind of distinguish them as two separate ideas for me, because I suppose I don't come from that kind of government model. But just sort of by way of a practical example, the way that I've seen it work altogether is very recently when we had been offered food from FareShare, and in order to receive the food, we had to ask every single referral 5 questions about what basically brought them to this situation and a number of other things. And because we were delivering 300 parcels, we practically couldn't do that, and we knew that it wasn't a COVID crisis. This was a systemic problem that was happening, and so we were very fortunate that we were in a position that we were able to say no thank you to that, and kicked up a lot of fuss, and our councillors kicked up a lot of fuss. Okay. And then that went away, and then the next time it came round, we saw that those questions had disappeared. And so it was a combination of us and other hubs who were having problems with the issue in front of us, but also the kind of the powers that be behind the scenes, and the brilliant the team at the council supporting all of that activity, slowly moving things together, impacting. So I know that doesn't address your question directly, but it feels like those can work together as much as being two distinct ideas.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a really practical illustration of what Simon was describing as well. So I think it's really it's completely relevant. And Jess, any thoughts from you on the same question? I'm sure you get asked it all the time whenever you go anywhere to talk about the community paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting one, because I don't want to go too deep or anything, but there is a crisis of democracy at the moment. Our system of kind of representative democracy, where we have a national election every 5 years and local elections on a rolling basis in some areas, but essentially every 4 years, means that that's kind of hidden, that the kind of discontent is often hidden within our system, but then it kind of rumbles up and boils to the surface when we give people something like a referendum, in which they can make a decision on something, and they don't necessarily play the part that they're expected to by the establishment, because there are some things about the way our country works that people get frustrated about, but we don't give them much opportunity to get involved or change things directly in different ways. So while we have a kind of system of democracy that is a representative democracy that sees it as an event in which you turn up and vote, and then you go away and you come back next time there's a vote, and we're living with the consequences of direct democracy in the form of a referendum, which happened 5 years ago, but we're still living with the kind of consequences of it. And what we're seeing in terms of kind of community powered approaches is deliberative approaches, which are much more sustained, much more focused on building consensus, bringing different people together from different tribes, different backgrounds, talking to each other that they wouldn't necessarily normally do, and discussing big complex issues, or participatory models where people have much more active engagement. These can sit alongside the representative democracy, but I think they offer a really new and exciting way of giving people more control and more power and more direct say, because we do know people want to kind of take back control, and we know there's a kind of growing skepticism of the establishment and the system and experts. And if we're not careful, these kind of darker populist forces kind of take advantage of that. So I think there's a real imperative on the state and the way services work to work in a much more engaging way, to give people that opportunity for voice and more participation if they want, and reflect that back into the system. So yeah, I think there's a big kind of background thing going on here that is not just a UK specific thing. It's a challenge of representative democracy, but there's so much possibility of technology, of how we interact, how we mobilise together, how communities mobilise themselves, that needs to be tapped into and taken advantage of, that isn't to such a great extent now, but could be.
That's brilliant, and again, it's a great thought to end on, and a great sort of positive idea in terms of how we could all work together in the future to build on the strengths of what's already there, but to bring in, as you say, this thing which is clearly filling a gap in terms of people feeling connected and engaged. And I had one final task for you all as a panel. One of the questions that came up in the chat earlier on was the characteristics of a strong and empowered community. And I thought a really great way for us to bring the discussion to a close would be for each of you, without wishing to put you on the spot, to just think of one characteristic that you would identify as being a characteristic of a strong and empowered community. I thought, what a great manifesto for us at the end of the event to have in mind how to identify and celebrate the things that create strong and empowered communities. Because it's slightly unfair, I'm not going to pick on somebody to go first. I'm just going to hope that somebody volunteers, because in the preamble time, you will have had time to get your thoughts in order. Joanna, excellent, thank you.
I know there's been a lot of conversations about trust and building trust. And for us, we're thinking alongside that about the idea of good faith and approaching circumstances with good faith. I think in a community where that kind of cultural democracy is happening together, that's very apparent. I feel like, I mean, it's been obviously a difficult time for a number of people. It feels like people, I mean, you'll probably get it as councils and all sorts of things, that people are generally finding it difficult and so approaching circumstances with less and less good faith. So I think stepping towards something with that kind of positivity and a yes attitude, I think that was the first thing that came to mind for me.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Joanna. And Jess?
Okay. Well, the first thing that sprang to mind is kind of how many people's names you know in your local area. I sort of think that if you don't know your close neighbours, and if you don't know that basic, then you're not a kind of cohesive community. But agreeing with Joanna and kind of building on that, it's definitely about that kind of consent. Does the community have space to talk? Is there space to start with a blank sheet of paper? They don't necessarily need to be kind of mobilised against something. Are they in conversation with each other, be it a WhatsApp group or something?
Yeah, thank you, Jess. And Simon, finally.
Well, I just thinking about what Jess said, in a completely random way, somebody asked me recently in another interview, what was the last time that I helped a stranger? And I thought if we asked ourselves that question more often, we might live in a completely different place. But I do think as a characteristic of communities, I do think empathy, and having empathy where we're not thinking about kind of them and us, whether we're talking about the divisions between the voluntary community sector and statutory sector, different groups living within our communities, you know, our neighbours and us, but actually recognising that people are more than just what they appear, and that they're more than just a collection of their needs and wants, would be a fantastic place to start.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much to all of the panel. I think it's been a really rich and reflective conversation today, which is exactly what we wanted, and one that's been really positively focused on practical next steps and practical thoughts, which is great. I can see that in the chat there's a whole load of sort of connection and an activity happening, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that between Steph and Francesca at New Local and our team, we will find some way of creating a community from this event, so people are able to kind of connect with each other, because I can see that people are exchanging emails and they would like to connect with each other subsequent to the event, and I think that would be great in terms of taking forward the impact of the conversations and the connections that we've been able to create today. And I think from my own perspective, if I'd been asked that question around strong and empowered communities, it is that point about connection that I think is also really important, just recognising the kind of the fundamental connected nature of all of our existences, and how when we work together, as a general rule, we achieve things which are so much more powerful and impactful than anything any of us could achieve alone. So that even though sometimes the process of working in any kind of partnership can be quite hard work, and often you can think, well, actually this would have been easier to do it in any other way, the reality is that what you create by bringing together a complex, rich mix of skills and experiences infinitely richer and more powerful than anything any of us could achieve as individuals or in organisations on our own. So on that note, I wanted to say thanks very much to everyone for the participation and the reflection today. I hope you've enjoyed the session and found it engaging and useful, as I have. And I think all that remains for me to do is to say goodbye and have a lovely evening. I hope everyone has got some nice sunshine where they are, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in some way following this session. Thanks very much, everybody.